All right. Good morning. I'm Amy Snyder from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for the Connect and Communicate series presenting 5 Revolutions for Advancing Cultures of Openness in Higher Education, Looking Beyond 2022. This discussion will be recorded and it will be made available to Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the PALA CRD YouTube channel, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you will only need a headset or speakers. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout the discussion, and we'll attempt to include your questions as appropriate during the discussion or at the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues, so please post those issues in the chat box as well. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, including Adam Balchunas, Christy Alderman Ritter, Diane Porterfield, and Ronalee Choco. Please contact any one of our team for information about becoming a PALA member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenter for today's event. Stephen J. Bell is the Associate University Librarian for Research and Instructional Services at Temple University. He writes and speaks about academic librarianship and higher education, change readiness, educational technology, open education, design thinking, and user experience. He currently teaches design thinking and open education courses to MLIS students at the San Jose State University iSchool. He authored 2 columns for Library Journal, From the Bell Tower and Leading from the Library from 2009 to 2019, and currently contributes a monthly blog post on academic library topics to the Charleston Hub. For additional information about Stephen or links to his projects, you can visit his website, which I'll post in the chat. So welcome. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Stephen.
Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. I appreciate that. And thanks, everyone, for joining today. It was nice to see the names of colleagues I've known for some time joining. So a welcome and welcome to new folks that I haven't met. I appreciate you being here today. Now that you have wrapped up most of your responsibilities for the prior academic year, whether that's finishing up evaluations, spending out your firm order money, doing annual reports, those types of things, and you're kind of getting refreshed for the upcoming academic year, I thought we might take a bit of a midsummer diversion here and talk a little bit about change in higher education and how we could all potentially be doing a better job of paying attention to the trends that have an impact on things that happen in higher education, because that's what we're all about here. And this isn't a presentation about a particular concrete practice or skill set that you will apply in your position or at your library. I think you get plenty of that content all year round, and it's very important. But I thought we'd do something a little bit different here, where we consider a different way of thinking about something that's really important to all of us, which is advancing openness in higher education. That's really what I want to focus on today. Now, that culture doesn't currently exist, at least I don't think to the extent that we would, where we want it to be, but I think we are continually making progress, and at different paces and speeds based on our own institutions and what's happening. Now, today, what I will do is present what I would like to call a perceptive lens for examining issues around cultures of openness. So not quite a framework. It's not a predictive tool of any sort, but it's really just, I think, more of a practical way to make sense of all the change that's happening externally to our institutions. But these are our external changes that we don't have much control over, but they can always have a significant impact on what happens in higher education. So I'd like to start by going backwards in time. So we're going to go back to 2012, and you may recall that Sebastian Thrun, who's pictured here, made quite a splash in the world of higher education and beyond when he emerged as a major proponent of MOOCs. Now, if you haven't thought about MOOCs lately, that still does stand for Massive Online Open Course, at least as far as I know. And here on the screen, you can see this really bold prediction that Sebastian Thrun made at the time. And I think it was met in higher education with very mixed reactions. I think the traditionalists, I would say, scoffed at a prediction like this. It couldn't ever happen. But if you look across the spectrum of higher ed futurists and ed tech gurus, online learning advocates, well, I think everyone had differing opinions all across that spectrum. And whether Thrun really believed this or not, or he just was trying to get attention, you could say that at that point, he and the concept of MOOCs really began an ascension that is probably still taking place today in the world of global education. And you may also recall that just about a year later, the New York Times called 2012 the year of the MOOC. So it was certainly getting a lot of attention. But I recently came across something I thought was kind of interesting that I thought would be a good thing to start our session with. And it was based on some observations by Jeff Salingo. If you don't know Jeff Salingo, he was an editor for the Chronicle of Higher Education for a long time. And now he's a consultant and writes quite a bit about higher education. He has a blog called Next, which is where I found this information. And he was thinking back, it's 2022. Okay, so this is 10 years ago. What can we learn from what Thrun did or MOOCs themselves? And he came up with, I thought, some interesting ideas about what is a possible scenario. So these are some observations that are not mine, but rather they are from Jeff Salingo. And he came up with something really interesting. So let's say there really were just 10 universities. What does that really mean? So he said, based on the current enrollment, each one of those 10 would have to enroll about 1.5 million undergraduate students, which sounds kind of absurd, especially when you consider that the largest online universities right now don't come anywhere near that. These are the so-called mega universities like Western Governors University in Southern New Hampshire. And that includes both their in-person, but largely their online populations. And Salingo, who I think is one of the more forward-looking thinkers, so if you don't follow his work, I really recommend it to you. He said that it is possible that we could have 10 mega universities, but they wouldn't enroll millions. They would only enroll in the hundreds of thousands like they do now. And there will still be other players, your institution and mine most likely, that would have some smaller share of the pie of higher education enrollment. And of course, as you would expect, elite and selective institutions probably will continue as they are today. And Salingo suggested that for all of our institutions, the key would be what he called optionality. And the idea there is that there are the spectrum of many different ways in which higher education can be offered. And we see that coming to fruition a bit right now. So some of us might align ourselves with mega universities. Some of us might want to stay very small and selective, but even those might need to be doing more online education, having collaborations with others. So this idea of optionality, I thought, was a very interesting concept. So what does Thrun and MOOCs and ideas like optionality have to do with this talk? Well, as I thought back then about Udacity, which is the institution that Thrun started, but you have others who are starting around the same time, Coursera, EduX, these all still exist and actually are offering not just free online courses, but many of them now offer degrees of one sort or another, or certifications, those types of things. But when I think back, what I think that all these institutions really speak to are the 5 revolutions of higher education and how these forces impacted on higher education and how they exerted change upon it. Or another way to look at it is that institutions that did not see this coming and didn't think it was something they needed to react to or change, maybe they become less relevant in some ways. But just briefly, here's my takeaway. Whatever we may think about MOOCs, and here's how I think they fit into this idea of the 5 revolutions that impact the higher education landscape, and that in some ways they're a product of those changes. So let's consider the following. Demographically, they reach masses of people who probably don't have access to traditional education, or they might be people who have completed degrees but want to have access to affordable education that can help them advance in their careers. So many of these folks are definitely non-traditional learners. And when you consider that that would be the more 18 to 22-year-old demographic that attends a residential learning, that has a residential learning experience. And so there's this expanding population of individuals that want formal higher education, but cannot get it at traditional institutions. And these MOOCs also attract masses of non-US learners. So we know the world is going, in the global environment, things are becoming or have become much more interconnected. So they meet that demand as well. Socio-culturally, it appeals to mass internet culture that would prefer to spend time online in social communities rather than brick and mortar classrooms. Economically, MOOCs take full advantage of the global demand for low-cost higher education options. You can't do better than free, or there might be a low affordable cost for certifications or some for-credit courses that can be accepted at traditional institutions. Technologically, educational technology makes MOOC platforms and methods possible by taking advantage of the technologies that can mass distribute education from one to many. So many of these MOOCs are based on having one very well-known educator that is doing prepared lectures that are going out to thousands and thousands of students taking the same class at the same time. So MOOCs radically altered the higher education learning landscape by demonstrating that there were other paths to learning, not just the traditional ones, such as gaining credentials that could lead to low-cost degrees, or they might have been boot camps for specific types of employers. Now, those are the 5 revolutions, and I'll go into them in more detail. But there's also a 6th revolution that I would say was somewhat unexpected or unanticipated, and one that was not a factor at all in the growth of MOOCs like Udacity. Again, thank you for coming to the session today. This is just my contact information that I wanted to put into the slides so that you would have it if you want to get in touch with me after the program today. Be glad to hear from you with any questions or thoughts, follow up. And again, thanks to the colleagues at College and Research Libraries Division of the Pennsylvania Library Association for inviting me to bring this Connect and Communicate session to you today. Now, this is what I'm seeking to cover in the session today. And I'm going to say right now that there are definitely things that I've probably overlooked or missed entirely. You may spot them or think of them, and you might see things in an entirely different way, which is great. And so feel free to use the chat when you want to comment or share your thoughts. I'm totally comfortable with colleagues in the session having exchanges between themselves. I think that's what makes this kind of learning platform so exciting. So go ahead and feel free to do that. And I'll have some opportunities for you to share your input as well. Now, I like the way this image speaks to the power of revolutionary change in higher education. And it's maybe a bit stereotypical, maybe even a little bit ageist, but it is accurate in some ways as well. We do have new generations of students and educators learning in very different ways. And it really is shaking the foundations of traditional higher education. And no doubt that is probably scary for some of the traditionalists that we know at our institutions and who probably would like to keep things that the same way that they've always been. But as we'll see with these revolutions, there are external forces that we have no control over. So they tend to bring with them trends and changes that can't be stopped and would in fact be difficult to resist. And we do try to resist them. often doesn't lead to good outcomes. Now, I have a chat activity. If you just give me a moment to explain, you can respond to this in the chat box. And I just have a simple question. Did your institution meet its enrollment goals for the fall of 2022? And you can just put in A, B, or C. Now, A means no. Your institution fell short of the target goal, at least as far as you know it did. B, yes, you met your goal, but just barely. Or C is a yes plus. You did even better than you expected. Now, I know at my institution, I've been here 15 years, and I think this is the first time, many years, maybe the first time at all that I recall that we didn't meet or exceed our enrollment target. So again, you can enter your answer into the chat, and I'll review those in just a second. And at our institutions that do fall short of enrollment, even when it's not that great, it does have a severe impact, particularly if we're a tuition-driven institution. So, we're looking at budget cuts across the institution, and I think it's not the first since the pandemic, but I think it's the first that is clearly connected to one of these more revolutionary factors that is tied to demographics, economics, and probably one or two others. So just taking a look at the chat, we have a bit of a mix here. I'm glad to see that a number of folks are saying C, that's great, but we also have a number of A's, probably about a 50-50 mix. And I didn't see any B's. So it looks like a lot of us are either falling short or we did better than we expected. And I think we are maybe a little bit past the summer melt, but many of us are already having students come in and for orientations. So hopefully whoever is showing up is going to show up, and we won't see more summer melt happening. All right, well, thanks for participating in that chat, and we'll have some additional activities throughout the session. So now that you know briefly about the 5 revolutions, and there's that 6th one, let me give you a little more background information on how I discovered this framework and to use it as an approach and a perceptive lens for better understanding what's happening in the world of higher education. So let me give you sort of the story. Now, you might not be familiar with Mr. George Keller. He was a longtime academic administrator, an educator, author, consultant, and he worked at lots of different institutions, and he consulted with presidents at many different institutions throughout the 80s and 90s. He also wrote some very highly regarded books about higher education, which are still highly cited. He usually wrote about administrative issues. 2 of his best known ones were Academic Strategy and Transforming a College. And the first one was really the first recognized book about the importance of strategic planning in higher education. And it's seen by many as a manual for how to do a strategic planning at your institution. The second one is about Elon College, which started out as a very not well-known, somewhat mediocre institution. And Mr. Keller did an in-depth analysis of how they went from being mediocre to being one of the most selective colleges of its type in the country. It's a fascinating story and really helps you understand why planning and being strategic is so important to our institutions. Now, in the latter part of his career, Mr. Keller was the chair of the Department of Higher Education at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. And I was a student there in the 1990s working on a doctorate in higher education leadership. And I took 4 courses overall with Mr. Keller. I really enjoyed him as a lecturer. He was really skilled at mixing theory with practice. He always had a great example to help you understand the theory. And that was because he did consultations with so many higher education institutions. He had tons and tons of stories to tell. But I remember in the first class I took, he gave this mesmerizing lecture on these 5 revolutions, which I'm now sharing with you. And I think they're so important because they still make sense today as a way of understanding what's happening in higher education. And I've been thinking about these 5 revolutions since then. and using them as a perceptive lens myself to help understand the critical developments in higher education and to critically think about how we got where we are and where we're headed. And Mr. Keller used the phrase perceptive lens quite a bit. He also liked the phrase cascading consequences, which I think is another good one for people working in higher education, because the idea there is you may come up with a great idea for a new plan, a new program, a new service, but he always encouraged his students to, okay, like think what's next? If I do that, what happens next? And then what happens next? And then what happens next? So think about, if I do this now, what's it going to mean years from now? And this is not a new concept for me, as you can tell. I've learned about this many years ago. And in fact, I did a presentation about it at the 1995 ACRL conference, which was in Pittsburgh. Back then, less than 1,000 people would come to the ACRL conference. But you know, I never really did much with it after that, but I've always internalized it and come back to it time and time again. And I hope one of the outcomes of the session is that you will pick this up as a tool that you can use to help understand things happening at your institution and beyond. So I'm going to go into just a little bit more depth about each one. And again, if you have any questions or comments to add about what's coming up next, please do so in the chat, and Amy will be monitoring that. She's serving as voice of the chat today. So again, demographic, socio-cultural, economic, technology, and learning are the 5 revolutions that I'm going to be speaking about. Now, demographic revolution, I think, is easy to grasp, and it is one of the more obvious external factors that significantly impacts what happens in higher education. Our existence as a provider of education depends upon having a regular flow of incoming students to keep our institutions viable. Now, for years, there have been predictions about the decline of the traditional 18 to 20-year-old students, the type that want that residential college experience, especially in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. And we have been foretold of declining enrollments and how that would have a negative impact on our institutions. And now with the impact of the pandemic and everything that's happening in the economy, because these revolutions are interconnected, that appears to be coming to a fruition for, I think, many of our institutions, except, again, the most selective elite institutions seem to be somewhat immune to this. But other demographic change, growing older population, declining birth rates, more diverse global population, these can all impact higher education. But demographics is at least a factor where I think we can see it coming and we can see how it's likely to impact us. And it doesn't always mean that it has to be a bad or negative impact, like it could make our enrollment go down and potentially impact our ability to be a thriving institution. If we are anticipating it and we're planning, we can look for where the opportunities in these changes are as well. And for me, the big question always is, how can the library do that? How can the library take some kind of leadership role where we see things that are happening, where we can be a contributor to helping our institution and our students be successful? Now, the socio-cultural revolution is also, I think, familiar to all of us, but it's not always as easy to see how it's going to impact higher education. There are many more possible external factors than we could identify than in the case of demographic change. It can be hard to imagine how different factors could impact higher education, but some are more obvious than others. And here are just a few kinds of examples of what we would call social cultural change. I think there are many others beyond this. And a few years ago, no one here in this audience or at our institutions probably would have suggested that critical race theory or even just critical thinking or free speech challenges could be upending higher education the way it is now. That's the thing with socio-cultural revolution qualities. Unlike demographic change, you don't see them coming as easily. They can emerge very quickly and gain our attention. Some of them will cross over into the economic revolution that I'll mention in a minute, because many of these are also financial issues as well, such as the diminishing middle class in our country, which was once a stable force for filling the classrooms in higher education. And we see that fading away a bit and how that's impacting us. But what's truly concerning is that a significant social cultural shift is the questioning of the very value of higher education. That conversation was almost non-existent just a couple of years ago. And now I think it has become very mainstream. And there's no question that the mass media attention on the student debt problem, and that being a huge debate within our country now about free tuition, erasing student debt, all those pieces of the conversation have brought the higher education value question into the mainstream as well. And just last week, the Inside Higher Ed published the results of a national survey, one of many that you probably have come across in the last year, in which they're asking people, what do you think about the value of college? And for growing numbers of Americans, they are not seeing it as an investment that will be worthwhile to them and have a good return, even though the data still continues to show that people with at least a bachelor's degree tend to earn more over their lifetimes. But on the other hand, we also have data that shows that there are still significant numbers of college graduates that haven't, even 5 years after they receive their degrees, finding jobs in their desired field. Especially now with the dramatic economic fluctuations we're all experiencing, primarily skyrocketing inflation, no or low economic growth on a global scale, bear stock market, recession worries, all of that we hear every day. The growing gap between the most wealthy and just about everyone else. It was just, we cannot escape these daily reminders of how the economic revolution can impact our institution. Here are more examples of what we're talking about when we talk about economic revolutionary factors. At our own workplaces, we all see that there's still a struggle to economically cover from the pandemic. And the fact that we had to close for months at a time in 2020. We can see how this has impacted our traditional higher education model that depends on tuition revenue and other ancillary income from things like housing and food services and sports even. Student and parent worries about taking on debt, which I just mentioned because of high tuition, are impacting the decision to attend college. And it's now regarded as a questionable investment rather than a necessity for successful adult life. The technological revolution is relatively easy for us to grasp. We have all seen many examples of it in our careers. And probably the longer that you've been in this profession, the more dramatic the scale of change has been. And again, technology can work for or against us. Here are some examples of the things that have impacted or will likely impact higher education. If you think about online delivery of learning alone, that literally saved higher education during the pandemic. I mean, just imagine if we had not been able to quickly shift to learning completely online when our institutions all had to close. That would have been even more of a disaster for us. But those same online learning tools have been adopted by other alternate education organizations that have actually done a better job of adapting those tools than our own traditional providers. And they have become savvy competitors that can deliver degrees at massive scale, less expensively, and in less time. If you're someone who doesn't necessarily crave the traditional residential college experience. Perhaps no segment within academia has benefited more from technology growth than our own libraries. And we are capable of doing some really amazing stuff. I think we all know that. But again, that technology has also become impossible for us not to have. And what we know is that it is expensive to maintain, acquire, and keep up with. And having just attended the American Library Association just for one day so I could go to the exhibits, there is just a constant flood of new technologies and tools that the vendors are sharing with us and potentially pushing at us, telling us that we could be even better libraries if we would just buy these tools and make them available to our communities. The way that Mr. Keller described the learning revolution, because this one may seem a little out of place with the other four, because learning is essentially what we do. You can think of it, that's the business that we're in, is that he meant it to encompass all the other types of revolutionary change that would be constantly impacting on higher education as external forces that we didn't have the control over, and that they would impact the learning landscape. So it does look a little more specifically at, okay, so what's happening in the classroom and pedagogy? How is what's happening outside of higher education impacting the way that we teach and the way that students learn? And again, I share just a few of the kinds of change that are presenting serious challenges to higher education. While many college closures were predicted back in 2020, there were people saying that a lot of these smaller institutions were not going to survive the pandemic. Much of that really did not come to fruition. There had been some closures, but not many, and mostly they're smaller institutions that were in financial trouble and enrollment trouble even before 2020. We have seen a number of interesting mergers, especially some in the Philadelphia and regional area. But largely, most higher education institutions have come out of the pandemic surviving as they were before. And certainly that subsidies and CARE Act money, all those sort of things have helped us to do that. But one of the things we're seeing is, as a result of the pandemic, big changes in the workforce. For example, people wanting to have more flexible work schedules. And we see this happening at every level among our staff. Now, Mr. Keller, way back in the early 90s, he spoke in many of his classes to the impending diversity crisis in higher education. He said that institutions needed to hire more faculty of color so that they would better reflect the changing demographics of the country. And I don't think that we students in his classes paid nearly enough attention to that. I know I didn't, and I kind of regret that. I wish I had listened and paid more attention and done more about that in my career, and trying to do more now. But that is just one of the numerous challenges that constitute the learning revolution. And we have many challenges yet to come. Now, I mentioned a sixth revolution that I think we're all well aware of. If you want to put in the chat what you think number 6 is, you can go ahead and do that. And I'll give you just a moment to see if you're on the same page as I am as to what's another revolutionary factor that I don't think that Mr. Keller, even with his experience, could have imagined this particular revolution. Yeah, think about what's happened recently, the last 2 years, something really significant that's had a big impact on our institutions. Yes, thanks, Catherine. The pandemic. That certainly has emerged as having, I think, as much impact as any of these other revolutions. And as I said, Mr. Keller could not have possibly imagined a revolution around a disease that would shut higher education down entirely. And that said, COVID was characterized as a black swan event, one that comes as a surprise. It's very rare and very hard to predict. And you might say that humanity, scientists, maybe even our institutions knew that these kinds of pandemics were possible, that they could transmit globally without our ability to control or vanquish it. I think we just didn't think it would happen here. We saw it happening in Asia and then in Europe in 2019. But even I remember in January 2020, a lot of us were still planning to attend conferences that were just coming up in March or April. And I had planned to give a talk or two. And this hit us so fast and so hard that we just shut down. There was really nothing else we could do. So Mr. Keller was certainly not the only higher education expert who didn't see something like that in coming back in his time. But I think now we will all be more aware of the possibilities that these black swan things that we don't even think about much could have a significant impact on us. So I want to take just a little bit of a break right here for any questions or comments. And if you want to respond to 2 questions in particular, I thought as I was going over those 5 revolutions and I was sharing lists of examples, did you think of any factors or specific trends that came to mind that, oh, yeah, I would include that in that revolution? So you could add into the chat another economic revolution is, and share what your idea is. And then I thought, I gave you those 5 revolutions. And I don't know if there was anything else other than the pandemic that you thought was also a very significant revolutionary force. Again, I'm basing these 5 on what I learned from Mr. Keller, and I never saw anything quite as significant as those 5. They tend to cover just about everything in one way or another. You could probably fit any trend into one of those categories. So if you had anything else that come up, feel free to ask that. And Allison is sharing, yes, diversity and inclusion is a revolution in itself. I think it crosses over into some of these. It's a demographic, socio-cultural. There's an economic aspect to it. And I would agree. Our higher education has, for sure, at most of our institutions, taken a turn towards diversity, and we're paying much more attention to how are our institutions inclusionary or exclusionary, and that is something we're going to continue to work with. And I'm going to say more about how does something like that have an impact on a culture of openness developing at our institutions. And Melissa's pointing out social media. Yeah, and that for sure, when I think of social media as revolutionary, the culture wars that take place, a lot of that, which has had an impact on higher education and putting pressure on higher education to change, a lot of that does happen on social media. So yeah, that for sure is, I'd say that's part of the technology revolution, but also social cultural. And Amanda has mentioned the change in mental health issues in higher education. And yeah, I think there's been a lot written about that in our literature. And we see this at all of our institutions. We're trying to invest more in providing students with better support for mental health. That one, I don't know how that quite may respond to the emergence and evolution of cultures of openness. But if you look at Catherine's comment, yeah, all of that is something I'll mention. There's a lot happening in scholarly communications that has moved the needle further along towards more openness at our institutions. And that too, as you'll see, could be aligned with what's happening in the technology area, but also economics. A lot of the change that's happening is because we just simply can't afford the system as it currently exists. And Amanda is mentioning, economics, increased food security, housing insecurity. And I mentioned that in the economics where, it's the loss of the middle class, people that can afford college education. Students we know have to make choices between their tuition, paying their student debt, and these basic needs. So I think the trend there is actually the movement that encompasses all these kinds of issues is the student basic needs. And that could even include mental health, and our institutions needing to pay attention to the whole, everything that comes under the umbrella of basic student needs. So with the eye on how do we help them to be academically successful and successful in their lives as well. And Melissa mentioned students less familiar with legacy publishing formats. And not sure, there could be a lot embedded in that, but that might be, is that students having challenges with deep reading print. There's a couple of possibilities. Okay, thanks for being more specific, right? All right, so thanks for all of your great commentaries there. I'm going to move on for keeping an eye on the time because I want to move into the next phase of the presentation, which I know you're thinking, Okay, those were some interesting ideas, Stephen, but what the heck does any of that have to do with cultures of openness? So now the big challenge is, okay, how do we connect those two things? And how do we start using the 5 revolutions as that perceptive lens to understand, okay, all the things you mentioned, the trends I mentioned, what does that tell us about change in openness and higher education? How can we use it to help us understand? So yes, let's move into that next phase. And when I speak of openness, by the way, I include all types of open activity, whether it's open source, software, open access and scholarly communications, open education, open science, open data, all those types of things, and other types of open sharing of content that are yet to come, that could emerge as we further build our cultures of openness at our institutions. But next I have a poll for you, and you can use your phone for this poll to respond, or you can do it on your computer. And I'll grab my phone. What I'm going to do, if you just give me a second, I'm going to bring up a QR code for the poll. And so there is a web address there if you want to do this on your computer, or I recommend if you just take out your phone and go to your camera and use it as a QR code reader. There's the QR code, and I'll kind of do mine right here. And then you should see the URL for the poll come up, just like when you go to the restaurants now, and you that's how you get to the menu. So everybody should know how to do this at this point. I know our students do. So I'll leave that up there for just another second. And then here you are. So you should have the poll on your phone, or if you went to your computer, that's great. So I just asked what words or actions, it could be just a single word, or you could type in a phrase, do you associate with cultures of openness? Okay. Yes, free. That's something we talk about all the time. Free versus open, especially with OER. What does that mean? Being free versus open. Yes, listening. I like that a lot. Sharing is the one that I would have typed in. Accessibility. Well, in terms of making things more accessible to everyone versus Section 508 ADA accessibility, but we need to have that too if we're using universal design to create our open things. Yeah, communication, yes, and no question, if we want to do a better job of connecting and creating diversity, equity, inclusion, being more open as institutions, and being more inclusive of who can get access to scholarly research and learning materials, that's important. Okay, I think you guys are, you colleagues rather, have come up with some excellent words that could all mean cultures of openness. So keep that in mind as we talk about cultures of openness. Those are all good examples of what we're talking about. Now, I did look around a bit to see if there was any kind of formal definition that anyone had come up for this phrase, and except as it applies to organizations and the need for transparency and trust in the sharing of information between layers of management and workers, I really didn't find much from open advocates that were using the phrase, though I'm sure there are folks beyond myself that do. You may use it as well at your institution. So I decided to go ahead and try to construct my own definition. And as the case with any type of culture, it's based in building a community where we have shared beliefs and values, where we center our attention so that we are intentional on advancing a particular cause that culture supports, and we work collaboratively to design and deliver on those values. And in this particular culture, the decisions that we make related to open education, open publishing, are weighed on the impact that they will have in advancing openness at our institutions. I think another way to think about this, the way I'm defining it, what relates to it, is that I would say it's similar to having a student-centered culture at your library or at your institution, and that the culture is guiding our decision-making. And so the decisions we make should always put students at the center of what it is we're thinking about doing and the decisions that have to be made. And we should be asking, how will this impact our students? Will it be positive in advancing our students' ability to learn and to succeed? And will advance their well-being and their welfare? Or will they not do that? But it's putting the decision-making at the center, or that thing, the student, or in this case, openness, at the center of the decisions we make. That's how I like to think about it, but you may think about it differently. So, and if we can do that well, then we can say that we are establishing a culture of openness at our institution. Again, if you'd like to share a comment about that as to what do you think openness culture is beyond the words you just shared in that poll, feel free to go for it. So the big question here in our remaining time is, okay, so how do these 5, or in this case, I've added 6 revolutions, what's their connection to advancing or possibly detracting from our ability to form cultures of openness at our institutions? And so this is the part of the presentation where I want to try to use those revolutions as the perceptive lens to think about how we are likely to have an impact in advancing the culture of openness. And again, these are some thoughts I'm just sharing. You may see it differently. You may see things I've overlooked. So again, make a note and you can share your thoughts. But I'll go through these again, the 5+1. So I'm going to, for each of the revolutions, I'm going to share a couple of factors that I came up with that I think are connected to building cultures of openness. So for the demographic revolution, these couple here seem to be the most significant factors, which I think is mostly a shifting of the generations that control the scholarly communications system in higher education. And my own experience, and perhaps yours, and it's probably a bit of a generalization, it doesn't mean applies to every single person we know, is that the new generations of faculty, I think, are just, in general, they are more open to openness. They see the value in sharing their research and data. They're more willing to publish in open journals. They're more willing to use open textbooks and library content as learning material. They understand that our institutions have to contribute to equity, diversity, inclusion, and that open content contributes to how that can happen on a global scale or even in their own classroom. We see that they're more willing to deposit their research into our open repositories. And I do think that the growth of international populations is a factor. Developing countries that are establishing their own systems of higher education and research often need to depend on open content, and they will in turn add to the growing volume of content. And I think the challenge here is that, again, a bit of a generalization, doesn't apply to everyone, but in general, the traditionalists, the boomer generation faculty are still the ones that are largely in control of our institutions. The next gen educators that we know, too often they're relegated to the ranks of the non-tenure and the adjunct. So they have much less power to leverage change in advancing an open culture, even if they believe how important it is. But I think as the generational change occurs in the professoriate and in the administrations, we'll see these new generations exerting their values that I believe will add to the growing cultures of openness. And I think the big tricky question is, okay, so how long is it going to take for this to happen? I don't know. I do believe it is happening as we speak. Now, while the social cultural trends, they're more numerous, they're more varied, there are more of those factors out there. They really are more challenging to connect to the culture of openness. If anything, I find them, they work more as contributing factors in some way. And by that, I mean, they may not impact openness as directly as some of these other factors that I'm talking about, but I think they could certainly work to move the needle in some ways to advance. And these are a couple of examples that I tried to come up with. Some of them do cross over into economics. For example, people have become much more accustomed to paying some amounts of money for limited content, as well as we have freemium and premium models out there. They may not directly impact the development of a culture of openness, but again, What I think it does do over time is it makes people more resistant to the idea of paying a lot of money for access to content. And they may even be content that you don't get to keep or control. And that's really what we have now with our scholarly publishing models. You pay a high fee, and particularly if you're an individual that isn't behind the paywall, you may pay a lot of money for a single time access to one thing. And I think we'll see growing resistance to that beyond what already exists. I think what we want to see are societal trends, again, that move the needle in the right direction of creating more openness in the sharing of content. And of course, content creators, maybe even some of those in higher education, want to monetize their content, but that's not always the case. I think we'll continue to see this movement towards sharing information rather than hoarding it. And what might also make a difference is just the unsustainability of our current subscription model in scholarly communications and the costs that our institutions have to incur to be a part of that model. If you look at families, especially what remains of the middle class, they're not coming, or they may not be coming in sufficient numbers to research universities, and it's their tuition to a large extent that supports this system that's been created. So I think that when that money starts to dry up in some ways at our institutions, if we don't find replacements for it, that might create changes in the system we have now. And again, that might not be the case at the elite, highly selective institutions that don't have the kind of enrollment challenges that some of us may have. The economic revolution. Now, there was a highly relevant article in Inside Higher Ed, I think you may have seen it, about the peer review crisis that is being caused by too few scholars being willing to agree to conduct peer reviews. And this trend is increasing the amount of time it takes to get articles through the publishing pipeline. And the editors quoted in the article are showing their frustration with the whole scholarly publishing system because they can't find people who are willing to do the peer review. And they've talked about having a free exchange system where if you get an article published, then you'd be required to do a review. That was one idea. But if you listen to what people are saying, the faculty, the producers of the content themselves, the researchers, they simply don't want to do this work for free anymore. They want a tangible reward, and it could be a direct payment. It could be getting more credit for your promotion and tenure. I think this is connected to trends in the global labor market where low salaries, unfair labor practices are being challenged in industry and the nonprofit sector, and it will have an economic impact on the cost of goods and the general availability of goods. So the best known economic lesson is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And we all know this too well in the open movement community. Somewhere along the line, flipping paid fee-based content to open or supporting it to be born open takes financial support. And we know that some of our institutions are paying money to support the development of OER books. We may be providing stipends to faculty to do that. We may be contributing to journal models that break down the paywall so that even though we're paying, it makes it open to everybody else. So I think those are some signs that there may be some change happening in the economic revolution area. And sure, there'll always be some altruists out there who are willing to make their content open simply because they think that's the right thing to do. But that may only get us so far. So we do have to continue to come up with models that reward content creators for the content that they're creating. Now, the technology revolution, I'll show some examples there of what I had in mind. I think more than any of the other revolutions, this has had a very significant impact on higher education to date. I mean, that's probably saying the obvious, and it will continue to drive change, particularly in the classroom, in the library, into the foreseeable future. And we have these publishing and learning platforms now that do allow us to achieve open sharing and distribution. I mean, if you want, you can take a course and make it widely available to just about anybody, or the learning content you create. And so in some ways, the tech is supporting the open vision. But in the end, technology simply is a tool that's at our disposal to achieve ends. I think the other revolutions are the ones where it impacts the more human dimension of our ability to create a culture of openness. Technology, I don't think will create the culture of openness. I think it'll just support it. We still have to have the will, the desire, and the capacity to shift to openness and create those cultures at our institutions. And here I'm just sharing a few tech trends that could very well open up the door to more online publishing. And again, you see the connections between the revolutions. For example, a new generation of the professoriate that is comfortable with using these technology tools to openly share their research. And hopefully, again, these technologies can lower the cost of production and distribution. Again, a lot of change happening in the learning revolution area, and this is all going to be directly related to helping to create open cultures. What we do know is that our own institutions can be highly resistant to the kinds of changes that we need to create cultures of openness for them to take root and fully develop. To be sure, again, some of the demographic and economic factors are going to necessitate change at our institutions if we want to be around for a long time, the next 100 years or more. But we're slow to change in higher education. I think we all see that our institutions. But if we want to build open cultures, let's take advantage of the changes that are happening in higher education, in the classroom and in learning. I think the important thing here is to develop partnerships. A lot of us are already doing that. I'm thinking partnerships with Teaching and Learning Center, partnerships with academic affairs. If we want to encourage them to incorporate openness into what faculty are learning about being educators, changing promotion and tenure policies, we don't have the capacity to do that by ourselves in the library. So in the learning revolution area, I think the key thing is developing partnerships and working collaboratively with colleagues. But we can take a leadership role here. We may not be able to make the change all by ourselves, but we can be the ones that help our institutions see that the culture of openness is good for all, and that we can work to build that together. And I think of all the revolutions, even though this is more short term, the pandemic probably did more to advance openness in the short term than any of these other revolutions. I mean, here are some of the things we all experienced during the pandemic. I think that the publishers flipping content from closed to open, even if it was for a little while, showed the world the value of being able to access research and learning content with little or no restrictions. And why wouldn't we now be asking, how come we can't make this happen within higher education when we're the ones that produce the content and we have the means to distribute it through our institutional repositories and other platforms? So we see that this actually worked. It can happen, but it shouldn't take a global crisis like the pandemic to be a catalyst for change, but it mostly was. And just consider the most recent Bayview Analytics report on faculty awareness and use of OER. It was very clear that, this is a report that came out in June, it was very clear that faculty are now willing to make use of digital learning content much more so than they were before the pandemic. And you can see that it changed the way faculty and students think about having access to digital learning materials, digital magazines, digital newsletters, digital everything. And now I think it's up to us to keep that momentum going. And again, the Bayview Analytics report seemed to indicate that faculty were now much more open to the possibility of using digital learning materials as for their learning content. So that's the kind of story we can tell and the message that we can continue to deliver. So we're just about at our time. I just want to say, I hope that the last 6 slides help you to better connect the 5 revolutions plus the 1. And again, while I'm wrapping up, I have 2 questions. If you want to start, if you have to go, I understand that. If you have a meeting or you have to get somewhere, we will be recording the remainder of this, and you can come back and catch the last couple of minutes. And I do thank you for being here today. If you can hang on for a couple more minutes, I will be wrapping up shortly. And I have some questions that were sent in with the form in advance, and I'm going to answer those questions. So if those were one of your questions, I'm going to answer it if you put that in the form when you registered. So the basic questions are things like, for me to you, are where do academic libraries fit into the equation here? How could you make further use of what I've shared today in your practice to stay on top of the trends across the revolutions that could advance openness at your institution? And again, if you want to comment on which revolution resonated with you the most, or that you thought was least relevant, or if you want to comment on how you might see yourself using this 5 revolutions framework as a perceptive lens, please go ahead and do that. Now, if you still have your phone handy and you participated in the poll previously, you should now see this new poll coming up. And I just wanted to ask one final question. How are you feeling about the evolution of a culture of change, of openness in higher education, or possibly at your institution? And all you need to do is touch one of the icons there. So it's basically a spectrum of I'm still extremely pessimistic to I am now feeling more optimistic that we may be able to create some change. I'm feeling pretty optimistic myself. So we are going to do a little bit of a transition. Again, if you have to go, thanks for being here. I want to thank especially Adam, Amy, and Christy from the College and Research Division for their support in helping me to put together the session today, and for helping throughout the session. And I now can take a couple of questions. You can put your thanks, everyone. I appreciate your comments there. If you want to hang around for just a few minutes, I will answer a couple of the questions that were submitted in advance, and you can put any additional questions into the chat box. And if you're heading out, good luck with your culture of openness, and don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you have any additional questions. Do you have anything to share here, Amy?
I'm just going to put a plug in. We did put a couple times a link to our survey. It is important for us for our LSTA grant application to get responses to that. So if you could take a minute to fill that out, that would be awesome. Just click on that link and fill it out before you go. But I don't see any other questions that have come through at this point.
Okay, then I can address the few questions that we did get.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so one of the questions was what role, and do we have a few minutes here?
I'm okay if you are.
Okay, do you want to keep the recording going? I thought we said that way people could hear the questions.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so what role does the academic library have regarding the open movement in higher education? Okay, well, to my way of thinking, and based on what you all just heard, is that I think academic librarians have a very crucial role to play in creating cultures of openness at their institutions, which in turn will encourage others to participate in the activities and practice that will contribute to advancing the open movement in higher education and beyond. My experience is that I feel strongly that the librarians can take a leadership role, and I point specifically to the open education movement, where I think we've had quite a bit more success, but than perhaps with scholarly communications journal publishing, but we've made a lot of progress there over the last number of years. And I think if we continue to build on that, we can encourage our colleagues at our institutions to follow our lead and build on the culture of openness hand in hand with us. So I think the academic library has a very significant role to play. The next question was, I'm curious as to how these revolutions are impacting different types of campuses. So large versus small, urban versus rural, selective versus a community college. Yes, and there's no question that some of these core issues are going to impact all of our institutions, regardless of size or type. So some of these economic issues, the demographic ones, they're going to have some impact no matter what. That's particularly the case with the pandemic, where we were all impacted by it, and it didn't really matter where we were or what type of institution. And if you look at economic factors right now, all of our institutions are paying more money for all the goods and services that we consume. I know that at my institution, one of the particular challenges are energy costs. It takes a huge amount of energy to keep a college open 24 hours a day. But to be sure, your type of institution could determine the extent to which these revolutions impact your operations. And as I said, highly selective elite institutions are going to be less impacted by enrollment. If you just look at what's happening in community colleges, if you just look at the data, the community colleges have been impacted the most by the declining enrollment factor based on everything that's happening in the economy and people being more or less likely to attend. On the other hand, if you look at the elites like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and similar institutions, they're being affected much more by socio-cultural revolution. You probably have seen that many folks are taking these institutions to task because they have enormous endowments and they're not using their endowments to be more inclusive. You know, their brand is be as exclusive as possible, have very low rates of acceptance. That's their brand. That's why people keep wanting to go there. But the tide is turning and it's like, okay, we need to be more inclusive, not more exclusive. So that particular revolution is also impacting them in a way that it wouldn't affect a community college. So I think what really matters, this is a good question, how do you think the revolutions will impact your institution? And I think that's what's important for all of us to think about these revolutions as a perceptive lens is, what does it mean for my institution? I'm not Harvard, Temple's not Harvard, so we don't really pay as much attention to what's affecting them. We need to pay attention to what's affecting us and what we're going to do about it. So that's my answer to that question. The third question was, how do you plan for budgeting to support open access publishing? Is it open scholarship only when the well-funded can publish? Now, this question is a little bit out of the context of what I've talked about, but I think what you heard me discussing reinforces that cultures of openness are about more than open access publishing. That's what the question was about. And I think that's a big part of it, that we don't want to ignore all these other areas like open education, open data, open science, open source, all things that higher education institutions have been behind developing and promoting. Now, maybe your institution cannot fund, for example, author processing charges. My institution has an APC fund, and it's helped a number of faculty to publish their works openly, but we could probably fund 10 times what we can afford to fund. There's that much interest in it, but this is probably not sustainable in the long run. So the question is, how else do you build these cultures of openness when it's not just about money? So can you help or encourage faculty to explore publishing in true open journals that don't require an APC? That gets back to the whole promotion and tenure issue. You know, do we see a change in people being less concerned about impact factors, for example? Good article about that in Inside Higher Ed today, based on a new Ithaca study of faculty. So I hope that your institutions, if you're not able to fund these types of programs at your institution and more openness, I hope you can take advantage of the work that others do, such as my institution, where, like, if you look at MIT Direct to Open, you know, we're subscribing to that package because it's good for everyone in that it will bring a lot of books and other content from behind a paywall so everybody can get access to it. So that's a little bit about, that's a challenge, you know, having the funds to make it possible. I think there are things we can all do together. And then there was, again, a bit of an unrelated question that someone sent in about what are my thoughts about how to graduate programs in library and information science? How do they prepare or not prepare current students for careers as future librarians? I do teach at San Jose State University iSchool as an adjunct instructor, and I feel like that institution in particular, and again, that's the one I'm most familiar with, is I think doing a great job of preparing students to be future librarians. They have an extremely varied curriculum. I think they spend a lot of time working with their alumni and people in the field to find out what do they need, what do they think their aspiring librarians will need to succeed in the future. And I think that it's a very progressive institution in terms of quickly changing the curriculum to bring in new topics and new instructors. So for example, I proposed teaching a course in open librarianship 2 years ago, and they were very open to that. And they said, sure, go ahead. And they gave me 6 months to prepare the course. And we started teaching it in 2020. And it's had excellent enrollment every time that I've taught it. So I think they're very responsive. So if we want to do a better job of preparing students for the future of librarianship, I think that the LIS programs have to be very flexible in bringing in new topics and new instructors to keep the students aware of what's happening in the profession. Where they're maybe not doing as good a job, I think we still could do a better job of creating practicums, internships. I still see too many students coming in from other careers. They've never worked in a library. And I don't think, and they're rushing to get through because it's expensive and they want to get a job and start working. And I don't think there's enough being done to get them into library settings so they can see what is actually happening on the ground in the profession. And my other big issue is that I would like to see us spend less time on MLS versus Master of Library Design. I'd like to see us focusing more on the profession as a design profession and less as a science profession. I think we would bring in more people into the profession. I see my students, the diversity in the classroom is really improving greatly. Still not enough Black students. I have more Hispanic, more Asian, more Indian, people from Asia, South America. The most of the students continue to be white female, but things are definitely improving. And I think we still are not doing good enough at reaching out to potential folks who from the Black community who could be future librarians. That's not where we need to do more there. So that's my thoughts on where we're doing well, preparing future librarians, and where we need to do better. So thank you for the folks that submitted those questions. And I don't think we did have any other questions, Amy.
No. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and I'd like to thank Stephen for presenting for us. Again, there's a link to the survey in the chat box, so if you could fill that out for us, that would be wonderful. As a reminder, the recording of this presentation will be available to PALA members and on the CRD YouTube channel. If you're not a PALA member and you're interested in becoming one, I'm going to put my email in the chat box, and I'll have someone contact you. And if you're interested in presenting for us, or if you have suggestions for future discussions, feel free to contact me as well, and I'll help connect you with who you need to be talked to. So I hope you have a great day. If anyone does have any questions, feel free last minute to throw things in the chat box, but also feel free to go on with your day and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks again, everyone. Take care, and do get in touch if you have any questions. Love to hear from you. Thanks.